We would like to give a special thank you to our sponsor, PROMOLIFE, bringing you closer to the benefits of ozone therapy. Proudly rooted in the USA, PROMOLIFE is at the forefront of assembling ozone therapy generators designed for both personal and professional use, right here on American soil. Meticulously handcrafted and precision calibrated, each ozone generator speaks quality and reliability. PromoLife has simplified the ozone therapy process by offering a complete line of high-quality accessories that allow you to use ozone in ways you never thought possible. Don't miss out and explore the entire collection of cutting-edge offerings at www.promolife.com/ozone. Make sure you use the coupon code in the description of this podcast for an exclusive discount towards your journey to enhanced well-being. I am also excited that our friends at shopc60.com are helping to sponsor this video. Again, that's shopc60.com. If you haven't heard of C60 before, also known as carbon 60, it is a powerful antioxidant that helps to optimize mitochondrial function, fight inflammation, and neutralize toxic free radicals. I'm a big fan of using C60 in conjunction with your keto and intermittent fasting lifestyle to support the immune system, help your body detox, and increase energy and mental clarity. If you are over the age of 40 and you like to kick fatigue and brain fog to the curb this year, visit shopc60.com and use the coupon code in the description for 15% off your first order and take control over your health today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to the 4th episode of Rowan Reports with Dr. Robert J. Rowan. The following is a conversation with Richard Gage, AIA architect. Due to YouTube and Spotify's terms of agreement and increased censorship, we are not able to place the entirety of this conversation on their platforms. If you are viewing this on YouTube or Spotify, I strongly encourage you to find us on Rumble using the links in the description of this podcast. To support this podcast, please visit our sponsors, also linked in the description below. Now, dear friends, please welcome Mr. Richard Gage. We are live. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Gage, AIA. He's an architect with 30 years from the San Francisco Bay Area, a member of the American Institute of Architects, and the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which is now an independent organization. He, along with his courageous wife and assistant Gail, continues to lead the charge towards a real investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11 at richardgage911.org. Mr. Gage became interested in researching the destruction of the World Trade Center high-rises after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on the radio in 2006, which launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11. The organization he founded, AE 911 Truth, now numbers more than 3,500 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. Please welcome Richard Gage, AIA architect.
Well, hello, guys, and thanks so much. Great to be here with you.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Gage. I wanted my followers, my listeners and readers to know that I invited you because I attended your talk at the Menlo Park Forum a few weeks ago, and I thought it was simply fabulous. Not only was the information on 911 just stunning, and all the American people should know, but as I'm a physician, and you put amazing links of the story of 911 and what we've been fed, and you put that together with events occurring in today's world with health issues that we're facing, the correlations were just stunning, and I want those who are interested in my work to see this. So we're going to turn this all over to you. This is your program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Rowan, and thank you, Lucas. It's an honor to be here with you guys and to share this information, which I also think is vital for the American people to wake up and realize that, in fact, there are 2 events, at least, and many more, actually, but we won't get into all of them, that radically changed American society and the world. I mean, politically, culturally, economically, geopolitically, 9/11 and COVID-19. And the question I asked Dr. Rowan is, were these intended outcomes? And we'll talk about what the outcomes were. And my belief is that, yes, of course, these were intended outcomes, meaning they were engineered in advance to produce those outcomes, these false flag operations. So we look for patterns. We try to connect the dots. We ask questions fearlessly. And that's what we're about. And we put the information out there, and we will see where the receptivity is. We hope it goes far and wide, as we've been giving these presentations now for the parallels for many months. They were originally developed by Kevin Ryan 2 years ago. And what I did is expand on them. So we can't, we don't want to blame Kevin for all the material that's in here, but he did inspire our original research, or our research with his original work. One question is, are there foreknowledge of events? Because if events are engineered, people know about it in advance. Are there drills practicing for each of these events? Is there insider trading? Is there predictive programming, foreshadowing of these events? Have they created an elusive, powerful enemy? Is there the creation of a climate of fear, which can be used, of course, to control people and manipulate them? Extreme control, in fact, of information and practices by powerful state agencies. Is there an abuse of science? Is there the response? Is it far more harmful than the original problem that they created? Is there a real investigation? Are there false official accounts? Is media censorship allowed? Excuse me. Is media censorship happening? Is questioning allowed? Yeah, there's lots of allowance, unfortunately, for censorship. Manipulating, shifting narrative as people wake up to the lies that are involved in these kinds of events. Are there serious conflicts of interest that can be shown with suspicious benefits for insiders? Is there the implementation of draconian policies and surveillance? Well, let's start with 9/11 and the evidence there, because I was just shocked to learn 6 years later, 5 years later, after 9/11, that there was a third skyscraper that collapsed. I mean, this was incredible. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects, and we did not receive one bulletin on this, in fact, which we'll show you is the third worst structural failure in modern history after the Twin Towers, which, if you compare it to the Twin Towers, you have half the height of the Twin Towers. But these were the tallest buildings in the world, the Twin Towers, at the time they were built in 1973. The Building 7 was built in 86, and it was it'd be the tallest building in most of our states. In fact, it's 47 stories tall, and it was about 110 yards of a football field in length away from the North Tower. And here it is standing just fine. In fact, after the towers went down, we have we might want to put you on mute while you're not talking, because there's a lot of background noise, Robert. Then we have a few beams that came out of the North Tower that actually hit the building. But this building's collapse was not, according to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. The building was not, that damage was not a significant factor in this building's collapse. Well, let's look at the collapse. Here it is. The east penthouse comes down first, 6 seconds earlier than this, which is what we see. Now, 6 seconds later. So we go, whoa, wait a minute. I think I've seen this before. There's 11 videos of this building's collapse. And we're going to take a deep dive well, in as much time as we have in this particular program, we have much deeper dives available on our website, which is richardgage911.org. Let's start, though, with the official narrative and see what they have to say about this building's collapse and what caused it.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
Okay, well, what fires? These fires. These are the worst fires that we have photograph or video evidence of in the building. As you can see, they're few, they're small, they're scattered, and they're out over an hour and about an hour before the building collapses at 5:20 in the afternoon. They have actually burned out by about 4 p.m. Now, we've had much larger, longer lasting and hotter fires in these skyscrapers, and we haven't lost one of them. This is a completely unprecedented event. We haven't lost one before Building 7's collapse. We haven't lost one after 9/11 either, and buildings that are fully engulfed in flames, not one of them. So we got to ask ourselves some serious questions here. What really happened on that day? Well, what we can do is compare it to a series of controlled demolition features, because this is how we bring buildings down to the ground. We have hundreds of examples of controlled demolitions, like the old hotels in Las Vegas. When they bring them down, we love to watch it. So the first feature is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, here's building 7. It's standing just fine, and then the east penthouse collapses first in an isolated event. A series of explosions seem to have brought that down early, and then the overall building drops like a rock straight down into its own footprint. So yeah, it's in sudden, uniform downward acceleration, as we'll get to. Is it straight down? Let's take a listen to Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Dan's using his intuition here, right? Destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down. Well, Dan has never repeated those words after 9/11. In fact, we've never seen on mainstream media, with two exceptions, this building being shown collapsing. Why? Why did they sweep it under the rug? Why didn't we in the American Institute of Architects have this be the most studied building failure ever? After all, it wasn't hit by a plane, right? So what should we should be, this could happen to any of 100 similarly designed skyscrapers around the country. There should have been a massive analysis of existing structures. All of a sudden, the firefighters go into burning buildings, skyscrapers, all the time. So now they have to change their policies completely, which they haven't. If this building really came down due to a few small scattered fires like we saw. Well, feature number 2, is there a patterned removal of the column supports? How do we bring a building symmetrically straight down into its own footprint? Guess what? We have to remove all 24 core columns at once, followed about a second later by the perimeter columns, and repeat that on every floor. Can fires cause that level of precision of destruction? These fires. So you begin to see how easy this is for us to discern a controlled demolition, but it gets even easier. Look how fast it comes down. we have physicists who have clocked the speed of this building's fall, and it falls at free fall. Guess what? That's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. And it gets faster and faster each second, the definition of free fall. And that can only happen if not one of these, oops, let me go back. I want to show you, not one of these columns gave any resistance. There's 81 columns in the building. Well, if one of them gave any resistance, it couldn't fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It would slow down. It would decelerate. It would actually stop when it meets the cold, hard, intact steel below. Well, NIST finally admits that it did come down at free fall because they were publicly embarrassed in a conference, their own press conference by members of AE 9/11 Truth, the organization I founded 18 years ago. And they finally admitted, because you can measure this, it's easily measurable. It came down at free fall. They said, yes, a third of its fall, at least that they admitted here, came down at free fall. But they don't acknowledge the implication of that free fall, meaning that the structure disappeared, because they had been denying free fall for like 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, actually, because the final report came out in 2008. And that's where they acknowledged, this is 7 years later than the building came down. They're juggling this football for that long, trying to figure out how they were going to handle it. Well, are there any sounds of explosions that might explain how these columns were removed instantly? First, according to NIST, let's listen to Shyam Sundar, the project leader there.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7.
They also say that there were no witnesses of explosions. Well, let's listen to a few of them. Here's Daryl, a medical student.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. And it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that. And we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You were in shock. And then the worst part.
Wow. Well, how about this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me,
and this gentleman,
an explosion.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere.
Okay, and this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Michael Hess, Giuliani's, who was the mayor, his attorney, were stuck in the building. The building had been evacuated after the 2 planes hit the building, and these guys didn't know it. They went into the building because they were called to an emergency meeting on the 23rd floor of the bunker, where this floor was designed to run the whole city in the event of an earthquake, emergency operation center. But they got up there, and somebody said, "You got to get out of there." They go, "Oh, okay," and they start down to get out, and this is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of
Bombs going
so you have
off inside Building 7, which wasn't even hit by a plane. And this is before both towers came down. And then after both towers came down and after they were rescued, these bombs were heard in the vicinity of Building 7 too.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay. All right. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
So these explosions are all denied, and none of these witnesses are included in the hundreds of interviews that NIST performed in their research to create their draft reports. Dr. Rowan.
Forgive me for interrupting, but I think the viewer needs to know who and what NIST is.
Yes, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're an organization under the Commerce Department. They were tasked by Congress through legislation to explain all three collapses to the American people, how and why World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 collapsed. So they have quite a role in commerce and so forth. But I think we should just compare Building 7 on the left to a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Building 7 on the left, with different views, known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there enough similarity to at least warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down a steel frame fire protected structure ever. Again, it's unprecedented. So all of the most relevant hypotheses should be evaluated. But this one, controlled demolition, was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions 10 years later and put on NIST's website because they were hounded by all of these questions. Isn't that a controlled demolition? Are you sure it didn't collapse by fire alone? Well, let's look at see what the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says. It says, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, like we see racing in every direction away from Building 7 at 35 miles an hour, with expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes indicating a whole lot of heat. I mean, a whole lot more heat than we see in these fires in this building. We're looking for something on the order of this. And guess what? We find it. Feature number 9, a very uncharacteristic feature of controlled demolition. We have hot spots exceeding 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than most office fires ever get. And so why do we have those kind of temperatures? And on the surface, guess what? There is no fire on the surface of this building pile. They're measuring something much hotter, deeper down in the pile, that's cooling off by the time it reaches the surface. And what could that be? Well, FEMA hands it to us in their initial investigation, which came out earlier in 2002, before NIST took over the investigation and threw out this Appendix C metallurgical examination that FEMA had created. What did they find in their metallurgical examination of the steel? They found never before observed eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like we see from this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Guess what? Office fires cannot cause this kind of damage to steel. They don't damage it at all. Typically, they're just not hot enough. They can cause it to bend at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel can begin to weaken and begin to bend, but it doesn't ever melt. But we have rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron. Guess what that is, Dr. Rowan? That's molten iron invading the grain boundaries of the steel. Sulfur formed, they also document, during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. What is all of this about? What can create this? Not office fires. In fact, listen to this. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says fire protection engineer Dr. Jonathan Barnett, the author of that FEMA report. Well, guess what? It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. What can do that? Office fires aren't even a quarter of these temperatures typically. So, and the maximum they get is maybe 1,400 degrees. Well, we'll come back to that question. What can create that? But we hired the University of Alaska's Professor Leroy Halsey, chairman of the Civil Engineering and Structural Engineering Department. He's one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. And he says, okay, we got to find out what the mechanism of failure here, because we got so many other buildings, hundreds actually, throughout the world. So he used two competing finite element analysis programs and to find out what happened. He spent 4 years, $300,000, and to determine what? That fire did not cause the collapse of the building. The temperatures were not hot enough to cause the weakening, the fire temperatures, that is, to cause the weakening of the steel framing, because the hottest fire temperatures they found or they could generate in here were, about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Thermal expansion did not result in the loss of support for the beams and girders, and as NIST claimed, and the building did not experience a progressive collapse, as NIST also claimed, like one floor falling on the other, where you'd expect to find pancakes at the bottom, which were not found. But a global collapse caused by what? The near simultaneous failure of all of its columns is what the actual report says. What can cause that? Well, we're going to get to that. But what we have here is all 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition, and some very uncharacteristic features as well. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives and incendiaries specifically, which we'll learn more about, and not evidence from destruction from a fire. None of these features can be created by fire alone, normal office fires. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony, we find that proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that has convinced 3,600 architects and engineers to publicly put their signature on a petition demanding a new investigation of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11, many of whom will appear in our docufilm series 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, which is going straight to a grand jury investigation, because we have filmed this in Washington, D.C. with our mock grand jury, and we present all the evidence, the largest body of evidence ever compiled and professionally presented before a grand jury, which is intended to be seen by an actual grand jury, which we are making happen, because we will give this evidence to the federal judge to be given directly to a grand jury. And this, it's already been submitted to the U.S. Attorney in Lower Manhattan for a special grand jury investigation, but he's not complying. They're part of the problem there in New York in the judicial system. So we're going to Washington, D.C., which is also part of the problem, but we will continue until we find a judge that will give this directly to a special grand jury. So all of that is exciting. We're working with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and we are going to Mick Harrison, the litigation director of that organization, which I also sit on their board, and we're partnering to make this film. Mick and I present the evidence along with a couple of dozen experts, and the Mick will present the analysis of the evidence to the grand jury and who they might subpoena for more information, persons of material interest, they call it. You can learn more about that film at richardgage911.org. And we have to ask ourselves, if Building 7 is a controlled demolition and it happened on 9/11, then it is necessarily part of the conspiracy, no matter how we might define that conspiracy, the conspiracy of 9/11. Somebody got into one of the most highly defended buildings in the world outside the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. Building 7 held the CIA, the IRS, the Department of Defense, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases, high-profile cases like Enron and WorldCom were sabotaged when that building went down. So we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that the Twin Towers may also exhibit evidence of controlled demolition? Well, you tell me. Let's put the buildings together. The North Tower on the left, the South Tower on the right. Is there any similarity? In fact, they look identical, with upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds. We're going to come back in detail and look at every one of the features here in the next few minutes, but we have damage in each building that's different. They're hit at different levels by planes, 30 stories down in the case of the South Tower, 15 stories down in the case of the North Tower. We have different fire damage, but we have complete identical damage as a result of what they call the collapse of these buildings. Let's get into it. Do we have a sudden onset? Feature number 1 of controlled demolition. Well, the North Tower is standing still, and all of a sudden it's in uniform downward motion. There's no jolt, no hesitation when the cold, hard, intact steel below is hit. Same with the South Tower. It's still, and all of a sudden it's in uniform downward motion. There's no impact resistance that is met below. And so feature number 2, do we have patterned explosions, flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, guess what? The fire commissioner recorded hundreds of his first responders. And this information was withheld from the American people until August of 2005, like 4 years later, when the New York Times won a lawsuit, and the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release the transcripts of these information, 12,000 pages of them. Well, they were read by Professor Graham McQueen, all 12,000 pages, and he subsequently found 186 first responders who heard explosions, saw explosions, were being blown around the building by explosions. Here's a couple of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down again and again. And we've got dozens of these on our website. I can't read all of them to you now, but again and again, you're going to see the order of events here. It's very specific. This phenomena of explosions is happening before the towers collapsed. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all 4 sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. How specific does it need to be? Let's look at the North Tower on the right, see what they're talking about. A controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? At least in the first 3 seconds? We'll slow it down here halfway. It looks exactly like a controlled demolition. So shouldn't it have been one of the possibilities, the hypotheses that NIST examined? No, it was summarily rejected as a hypothesis, being a ridiculous conspiracy theory, which they only added again years later to their very frequently asked questions. South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Again, is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like this particular controlled demolition. What did the first responders say?
We started running floor by floor instead of out.
It was like, if they had detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Okay, well, there's dozens and dozens of those kinds of images, but we've got to move on. Testimonies. The official narrative says the top part of the building drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, this completely violates the third law of motion, Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. The upper part will be destroyed because it's actually the lightest part. It's like a Volkswagen running into a Mack truck. The Volkswagen will be destroyed first. In fact, that's exactly what's happening. You can watch the upper part is being destroyed. Watch the lower red line. It doesn't move down for several seconds, a couple of seconds. The upper part is telescoping in on itself. The question is what's destroying it, and we can see visually just hundreds of explosions billowing out of the building. But if it were there, you would see it driving the rest of the building down to the ground. The red box indicates that it's missing, where none of the photos, none of the videos show it. Had it been there, it would have destroyed these few remaining core columns that survive the building that's been blown up around them. So, and then they experience an explosion perhaps below, which shakes off the concrete powder, and then it descends frame by frame through the concrete powder. It's not turning to dust, as is claimed by some. Here you can see the top of it descending frame by frame. This is a common error that we have to debunk. And feature number 3, is there a straight down symmetrical progression? Remember, we have asymmetrical damage from the planes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, asymmetrical loading from particularly the South Tower that's falling off. But watch, we have complete symmetrical damage from the top all the way down to the bottom. Very systematic, very precise, floor by floor. In fact, we can zoom in on one corner, the leading corner of this destruction, and we can see just in this looped video a dozen individual explosions. It's just as clear. This building's not being destroyed by energy weapons or nuclear weapons. It is being destroyed by individual explosions, easily seen in this particular video and many of the others too, actually. In fact, we have isolated explosive ejections, one of the features of controlled demolition, occurring 20 stories down below that zone of destruction, even 40 stories down below that zone of destruction. And if we watch, we can even see 60 stories down below. There's nothing in the official narrative that can account for these individual isolated explosions called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. In fact, we can look at the left side of the South Tower as it begins to tilt over. On the left side, we see individual explosions, dozens of them in this looped video, almost all at once, destroying its internal structural framework, so it no longer acts as a rigid body and continues falling off the tower as we might expect, but settles back down into a fairly symmetrical collapse all the way down to the bottom. There's nothing that can explain these isolated explosive ejections either. other than controlled demolition, which would cause a near free fall collapse. We can put, let's time it, on the left, a timer, on the right, an animation. We have about 7 seconds here. You can see how fast it's 10 stories per second that are being destroyed all the way down to the ground. This is near free fall acceleration. In fact, it's been also actually measured by physics teacher David Chandler and others, who find that it's 64% of the acceleration of gravity. It's not slowing down. It's getting faster and faster and faster. It's accelerating through what? All of this steel. 47 massive core columns inside of this exoskeleton, comprised of 14-inch square steel tube columns marching every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building, hundreds of them. So why isn't the building slowing down? Well, we'll get to that. Well, that's the reason, but let's find out what other evidence we have here with the feature number 6, the total shattering of the structural steel building. In fact, the NFPA 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says look for shrapnel effects. What's that? High order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished and debris thrown great distances. Well, that's exactly what we have with each of the Twin Towers. The complete dismemberment of the building, in fact, laid out over the entire World Trade Center boundary and beyond. Chopped, if you will, shattered into its original structural lengths to a large extent, save these shards that remain at the bottom in that for whatever reason weren't all the way shattered. So they also say look for the National Fire Protection Guide says look for blast pressure wave effects. What? Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, like we see embedded into the skyscrapers all around the World Trade Center Twin Towers and destroying the Winter Garden 600 feet away. And here, freely flying structural steel sections. This is not like a banana peeling like we've been told by some of the debunkers. These are freely flying. Look at that one. Back to, forward to, back to. It starts out horizontal. This is a 4 or 8 ton structural steel section. How does gravity work? Down. So what's going on here? Out. And there's hundreds of these. In fact, we'll come back to that. The trailing thick white smoke clouds of a steel section. That's unique. But if 100,000 tons of structural steel framing is distributed outside the footprint, I mean 99%, you don't see a huge pile of Twin Tower up here, only a 4-6-story pile. We have to ask ourselves, Dr. Rowan, what is crushing this building if 100,000 tons of its structure is distributed well outside the perimeter? It wasn't available to crush the building, right? It's not going to be doing that. Well, maybe it was the concrete, because this building had 110 concrete floors. We're looking for them. When we have a pancaking collapse, we have pancakes, like on the right in a real gravitational collapse. On the left, at the North Tower, we see a 3, 4, 5-story pile of miscellaneous metal, some structural columns, but 98% of it, at least 99, is well outside the footprint. In fact, that's the steel. Where's the concrete, though? Each floor was an acre in size, 4 and 8-inch thick concrete floors, 110 of them. We don't see 50. We don't see 10. We don't see one of them. Where's the concrete? Oh, there it is. It's being pulverized in midair. All the photos, all the videos show 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized, missing from each of the buildings. Pulverized 100 micron particles. It's like baby powder, they described it. It's very, very, very fine. So we don't even have huge piles of gravel. For some reason, somehow, it was pulverized, covering lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area from river to river with a 3-inch thick blanket of concrete powder. 30% of this powder is concrete by the tests of the National Geographic, excuse me, the U.S. Geological Survey. By the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, we have to ask ourselves again the question, what's crushing the building? The steel was half the weight of the building. The concrete is at least another quarter of the weight of the building. So more than 3/4 of the weight of this building is not even available to crush it. This is pure honesty, and it's pure fraud on the part of NIST, again, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to put forth the incredible weight crushing the building below. It wasn't even available. There's not much left, in fact, in terms of weight of the building to crush it. So surely, though, the evidence would be saved so that forensic investigators could do a proper forensic investigation. Well, here's one of them. Structural engineer Abolhassan Nastani Azal, who was given National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. But here's what he says.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound.
15 cents a
nothing.
pound they got from China to recycle this steel. It was put on barges starting 2 weeks after 9/11, and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures. We have 400 truckloads a day lined up like an army convoy. To take this steel to the landfill and then to the barges and then to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't, of course. And so we have to ask ourselves, what could cause the temperatures associated with the destruction here? In fact, we can see by the material pouring out of the crab claw excavators, its color of, we can tell the temperature of molten metals by its color here, yellow and even white hot. It's 2,500 degrees minimum. Well, guess what? Jet fuel burns at 600 degrees only in open air, according to its manufacturer, ME Petroleum. So jet fuel doesn't account for these temperatures, and nothing else does in the official narrative whatsoever, which is why they deny and don't show any of that. The fires that we have evidence of are, according to NIST, the only 500 or 600 degrees Fahrenheit. They claim 1,800 degrees, but their evidence shows only 500 or 600 degrees, which we get into in our documentary. Molten steel beams. We have all these firefighters talking about metal dripping from a beam. The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, a little river of steel flowing. They actually took him down in the basements to show him this stuff. He's a very credible witness. And concrete melted in the police museum. They say fire temperature is so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It melts at 3,200 degrees. Those temperatures are completely unaccountable for, of course, also in the official narrative. This is a handgun, which is why it's in the police museum, that the molten concrete wrapped around. What can be responsible for these temperatures? Is thermite a possibility? Well, one nuclear physicist, Stephen Jones, former professor at UC at Brigham Young University, says, "Gosh, if thermite were used, you'd expect to see a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, and like we see pouring out of the material held in the hands of the crab claw excavator, and like this gentleman described."
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames. So what could
cause that? Well, he says if thermite were used, you'd also expect a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising from the material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, and like we see trailing these freely flying structural steel sections back to, forward to. Why are steel beams trailing thick white smoke clouds? In this case, evidence of ignited thermite in the form of aluminum oxide ash, which it releases. Let's face it, steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. It never has been, never will be. It can weaken, as we described, at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit and begin to sag, but it's not flammable. Something else completely is going on here. It looks more like the volcanic eruption, in fact, in the Tongan Sea, with upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects, molten solid objects, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. So if that was evidence, and it can only be evidence of ignited thermite, there is no other explanation. Is there evidence, more evidence found by official sources like the U.S. Geological Survey in their particle atlas of the dust in 2005 of ignited thermite? Yes, for iron microspheres, billions of them. They don't know where they came from, but there's billions of them. In fact, up to 6% of these dust samples, comprising about 4 tons altogether, are previously molten iron microspheres. In fact, R.J. Lee Group says they're formed during the event, not before, by the welders putting the building together, not afterward by the iron workers taking it apart, but during the event. They don't know where they came from either, but they're formed during the event. Well, my gosh, the EPA even says they're so ubiquitous, they're a signature component of the World Trade Center dust. But we don't know where they came from. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres. Where do they come from? Let's perform an experiment. Dr. Rowan, you perform experiments. This experiment is thermite, a small amount of thermite. Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. You can prove something. So we ignite thermite. It produces what look like sparks, thousands of them, but they're not sparks. What are they? They're molten iron microspheres. Molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Aluminum oxide ash is the other. And so how do they get to be spherical? Well, that's just what aerosolized liquids do under pressure. They form themselves into sphere by surface tension. Could that be what could explain the toasting of the tops of these cars? Is there any other explanation in the official narrative or otherwise that could possibly explain the toasting of the tops of these cars, like liquid molten falling droplets of iron? That's what works for me as a very high heat event. So if that was, and it can only be, evidence of ignited thermite, we have to ask ourselves, is there any evidence of unignited thermite? And guess what? There is. In all the dust samples, a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen identify in these independently collected samples the same red-gray chips. They thought they were paint at first, but they're attracted to a magnet. They go, whoa, why is this paint attracted to a magnet? It must have a high iron content, the key ingredient of thermite. They go, whoa, what's in this stuff? They analyze the red layer with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, XEDS, and they find what? Iron oxide, which is essentially rust, by the way, and aluminum. So they have the two only ingredients of most thermite. They go, whoa, the paint should not have thermite in it. Let's do a deeper analysis. Zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope. And what do we find? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder, smaller than the diameter of a human hair by 1,000 times. Very sophisticated material set in a bed, a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is organic material. Organic material is used in TNT to expand rapidly because of the gases that form. And that knocks things over. That's what high energy explosives do. They knock things over. Whereas incendiaries like thermite cause damage by burning things up at 4,000 degrees. Well, this was developed prior to 9/11. In fact, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory and Los Alamos Laboratory called it super thermite. It is, they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, these chips, and they ignite, which is fascinating at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's exactly what these chips did too, proving what? That they're exothermic reactions, that they're thermitic materials. In fact, when they ignite, what do they produce? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres produced in the World Trade Center dust and as documented by the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee. So you see, we know exactly where those microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as we see here and here. So this stuff is so sophisticated, when you get it so small at the nanoscale, the surface volume increases exponentially. And so the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. So you've engineered something that's an incendiary to become much more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we can show through this 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal that the red layer is unreacted thermitic material, incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or even explosive material. So that could be brought to bear in a court of law or a special grand jury investigation, as we're making happen currently, to bring the real perpetrators to justice. How would they have gotten this material into the World Trade Center? Well, it's interesting. We had fireproofing upgrades in the years before 9/11. And curiously, they're situated on floors directly associated with the airplane impacts, which begs the question, were these planes responding by remote control to a beacon and is supposed to hit the specific floors, or were the hijackers who failed Cessna flying school capable all of a sudden of controlling a 767 and flying it into a 200-foot wide target at 500 miles an hour? Most pilots who've looked at this suggest that that's impossible. So those are open questions and research that's being done by others. We also had an ACE elevator who got this contract to modernize the elevators in the 9 months prior to 9/11. A huge effort, and 85 of these employees fled before the towers came down. So they were they without adequate explanation, they somehow got this contract from Otis Elevators, who installed the elevators and had been maintaining up to this time them. Ace Elevator came out of nowhere, and they went bankrupt immediately after 9/11. Very curious. So perhaps that would have given them access to the core columns and beams in the building through the elevator hoistways, which were just made of 2 inches of gypsum board. And there was lots of complaints of white dust coming through the air conditioning systems, which, of course, if you ever worked with gypsum board, is full of that kind of problem. So those are questions that need to be answered. But we have 10 key characteristic and mostly uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, not one of which can be explained by destruction of fire, let alone all of them with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony. We find this to be proof of controlled demolition. Again, that's convinced 3,600 architects and engineers who will be appearing in the film 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom that I mentioned. And the overview of this evidence is on the brochure, which you can download and print for free and pass around on our website, richardgage911.org. And that is the overview of the evidence that we have to share for the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7, which I think in over 700 presentations around the country, I always do a show of hands, and it's like 95 to 100% of people all agree a new investigation is necessary. What do you think, Dr. Rowan?
I think a new investigation is mandatory. There's no doubt about it. The evidence is overwhelming. And a criminal trial talks about evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. I think you've shown that here.
Well, then we got to do something about it. I'm certainly doing something. You're doing something. You're bringing it to your wonderful audience. And we're asking all of you to share this information, because it is essential that people realize that in the health freedom movement, particularly, that there's a chain of events called false flag operations that go way back. Almost every war, major and minor, has been started with a triggering event in the war system, as Professor Graham McQueen calls it, that needs these triggering events to manipulate populations to go to war with a neighboring country, or with something called COVID, for instance, because we have yet another, what I would call a false flag operation and during the last 3 years. And it turns out that there's some parallels between these two operations, and that's what we want to begin to look at this time. And I'll reshare my screen if you'd like, and we can go into the parallels between 9/11 and COVID.
Thank you for listening to the first part of this conversation with Mr. Richard Gage. To listen to the rest of his findings and how the events of 9/11 draw many parallels with the COVID-19 pandemic, I strongly encourage you to find us on Rumble using the links in the description below. Now, I would like to leave you with some words by Abraham Lincoln. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. To support this podcast or Richard's organization, please visit the links below. If you found this conversation inspiring, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Until next time, stay safe and be well. Before we jump back into our discussion, I want to give a quick shout out to PROMOLIFE. If you haven't heard of them, they're leading the game in ozone therapy. Crafted with care right here in the USA, their ozone generators are top notch. Beyond that, they've got a full lineup of accessories that truly opens up the world of ozone in innovative ways. Support this podcast and check out what they have to offer at www.promolife.com/ozone. And as a little perk for our listeners, there's an exclusive discount code waiting for you in the description of this podcast.